All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us during the Lytham Partners Fall 2023 Investor Conference. My name is Robert Blum, Managing Partner of Lytham Partners. Up next, we have a panel presentation, which we hope you'll find insightful, with executives from two late-stage development companies focused on cardiovascular markets. We have titled the panel Cardiac Kids, Late-Stage Advancements for Cardiovascular Disorders. A little bit of background here. Cardiovascular disease, the leading cause of death worldwide, including in the United States, where about 20% of all deaths are caused by heart disease. However, highly effective medications can lower the rates of death and disability related to cardiovascular diseases. According to reports, the cardiovascular drug market will attain a $231 billion value by 2030, CAGR more than 4.5% over the next number of years. Advances in genomics, personalized medicine are reshaping the cardiovascular drug landscape. Tailored treatment approaches based on patients' genetic profiles are influencing drug development strategies, leading to more precise and effective therapeutic arsenal for cardiovascular conditions. Today's two companies are developing solutions for acute cardiovascular critical conditions with advanced stage programs intended to address large markets with significant unmet needs. So with that, let's get started. We'll have each of the panelists introduce themselves and their companies in some brief detail, and we'll get into their companies a little bit more later on. So Quang, why don't you begin?
Thanks, Robert, for having us. Good to be on the panel with Craig as well. Quang Pham, the founder and CEO of Cadrenal Therapeutics. We are focusing on developing tecarfarin, a late-stage novel oral and reversible anticoagulant or blood thinner to help patients who develop blood clots, also have rare medical conditions. I've been working on tecarfarin and its IND since 2017. Earlier this year, we took Cadrenal public onto NASDAQ and subsequently raised $7 million in the IPO. And we also did a PIPE with the help of H.C. Wainwright in July and raised another $7.5 million. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss with you the cardiovascular markets, particularly in the United States.
Perfect. Thank you, Quang. And Craig?
Hi, I'm Craig Fraser. Good morning, Robert and everybody. I've been in this industry for about going on 34 years. I'm the CEO right now and chairman of Windtree Therapeutics. We're a NASDAQ-listed company as well. And my career has always been focused on specialty therapeutics, some small startups like Windtree, and running some of the larger businesses and larger companies. Windtree, we have a focus for acute cardiovascular and disorders, primarily stemming from people that have a failing heart, that are in acute heart failure. And we think it's a great focus. We're coming off of some strong positive data, very successful raise in the late spring, and we're in full execution mode. So glad to be joining you this morning.
Fantastic. Thank you both for that. Quang, I think as I mentioned at the beginning, this is obviously a massive market. Talk about what you see as sort of the key drivers, particularly here in the U.S.
Well, I think when you talk about cardiovascular drug development, start off with the holy grail, heart failure. We're not seeing much development like we did 20 years ago. Moving on to lipid-lowering drugs. It's a very mature market with many generics, and we're starting to see single gene editing therapies entering the clinic for lipids lowering. As far as antihypertensives, certainly we have a broad variety of therapies, many genericized now. But what we're looking for now is mostly therapies focusing on rare cardiovascular conditions, of which we're focusing on a number of them.
Sort of Craig, on the development pipeline, typically very long for cardiovascular drugs. Talk about the development pathways, the difficulties in trying to bring new drugs to market. Any new changes that the FDA has put in place over the last number of years to assist in the process?
Sure. I think you just heard about some of the largest kind of traditional markets. And frankly, some of those areas, if I go back in time, decades and decades ago, was areas where I came in. And we've solved a lot of things like hypertension, and frankly, those were easy. What's left is the more difficult things that I think, we're focusing on with very novel technologies now, like you're seeing in both of these companies. However, the long outcomes, because so much of cardiovascular has pretty pronounced morbidity and mortality implications, traditionally regulators and the treating physicians themselves have wanted to see the ability of a drug candidate to impact those. And I think some of the areas that have differed is in looking in spaces that are acute in the hospital, that are very serious conditions where you can do the type of work and the outcomes that you're seeking are measured in very short order, or there's a lot of events and it's pretty pronounced. So that helps it be a little bit more manageable. And that's what we're focused on, really both companies. And I think the FDA has recognized and made some changes. We're primarily in the area of heart failure and cardiogenic shock. And in 2019, new guidance came out and guidelines came out that instead of big mortality-based outcome type of studies, they're still requiring clinical outcomes, but many more endpoints that you can wrap your arms around a little bit easier, like reduced hospital length of stay and readmissions and things such as that. So there are some moves in that direction. And then for us, we focused more recently on cardiogenic shock, which has a very attractive regulatory pathway, we believe. So I think if you pick your areas right, you can still produce very meaningful drug candidates that exhibit the type of data and effects that people are looking for without those big traditional multi-year large-scale outcome studies.
Right. And maybe in Quang, sort of building a little bit on your earlier question there or response, besides your drug tecarfarin, which again we'll talk about a little bit more here in a moment. From your perspective, what are some of the biggest areas of focus within cardio drug development taking place right now?
I think, Robert, looking at the investment community and news releases, as well as the FDA drug approval websites, what I've seen is, like I said, the single gene editing for lipids lowering, which is an advancement potentially. We saw the PCSK9 come out, about 5-6 years ago, and before that, a number of different lipids lowering therapies. We also have seen the development of a new anticoagulant class. Certainly, the class of the vitamin K antagonist, the original warfarin Coumadin, and then the factor 10 inhibitors are direct oral acting anticoagulants such as apixaban, Eliquis, and rivaroxaban, Xarelto. That class starting to be coming near end of its intellectual properties, going in generics in the next few years. So the next class are called the factor 11s. Certainly, a lot of development as well as investment has been made, and they're advancing through the clinical trials. We've also seen a number of rare cardiovascular drugs for orphan diseases approved in the last few years, particularly the drug by the company called MyoKardia, which was acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb a few years ago, and then a drug developed by FoldRx, another company that was acquired by Pfizer. And both of those drugs are very highly priced, as well as for treating rare cardiomyopathies.
Gotcha. And Craig, maybe same question for you. Besides your lead drug candidate, help educate our audience about some of maybe the most talked about areas of focus within cardiovascular drug development right now.
Yeah, I think all those that you just heard are very hot areas for innovation. I would add, and go back out to the big picture as well, I would add the GLP-1 receptor agonist. And of course, we're hearing so much about them for cardiometabolic, diabetes, and of course, weight loss, the Ozempic and the rest of them. And it's almost overshadowing the pretty pronounced cardiovascular risk reduction, that you see from them, and how they're going to shape heart failure chronic treatment or discharge treatment. Now there's still huge needs for the manifestations that put people into the hospital and how we treat those patients acutely. But I think that because heart failure still remains such a big, massive area and is the top reason for hospitalizations and so forth, you are starting to see different interest in different forms of heart failure, how you reduce some risks of going into hospital. So I would add that category as well.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Quang, coming back over here, when you look at some of these, the biggest cardio drugs that have come to market, and I think you mentioned a couple just a moment ago, that sort of came from small companies versus those that were, from sort of large pharma. What is sort of the development internally versus those developed by the larger companies?
Well, I think when Camzyos, the drug that was developed by MyoKardia, which was acquired by Bristol Myers Squibb, was in the development, you can see that, as was mentioned earlier, cardiovascular drug development in the trials seems to be, long, outcomes driven, 2 phase 3s. So what you see with the Camzyos, the MyoKardia drug, was that the pivotal trial was fairly small for cardio trial. As far as pivotal, I believe the number was under 400, and it was against placebo. And when the drug was approved, it was priced at nearly $90,000, which is not what you would see for a chronic cardiovascular medication. And the other drug, Vinquidel, which was developed by FoldRx, that pivotal trial was also against placebo, and fairly small, under 500. And when that drug was approved, it was priced at $225,000, making it the most expensive cardiovascular drug. And I think we see those in oncology and other rare orphan diseases. For cardiovascular drugs, and I think Craig would say this in his 30 plus years, you can see that reimbursement was success for both of the drugs, and that there is a precedent now for rare cardiovascular drugs that are approved and available for patients with unmet medical needs.
Yeah. Craig, when companies say there's a high unmet need in a disease state where they focus on drug development, all right? How would you describe high unmet need where you are focusing?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's almost become a cliche when, everybody's going high unmet need and so forth. And you really need to drill down into the practicalities of it and what we're really seeing. Now, the area that we're focused on, to answer your question, we're operating in the spectrum of heart failure, but we're down in the area where people are having an acute episode where there are moments of crisis where they're in the hospital, and along that spectrum all the way down to the most severe manifestation of acute heart failure, this area of cardiogenic shock, when they're actually sliding into shock. But if we just look at that space, there's nearly 8 million people in the United States with heart failure who probably have all had a relative with heart failure. And here's the thing is, with these episodes of decompensating, becoming unstable, fluid overload, going into the hospital, is the number one reason for hospitalizations in the US and Europe, probably most any country in the world, in people over the age of 65. It's the most common reason. And in fact, it's the most expensive Medicare diagnosis. Even in regular heart failure, acute heart failure, there's about a 7 or 8% mortality, about 10% inpatient, about 10% over 6 months. And then when you slide down into the area of cardiogenic shock, those numbers just become much more pronounced. When somebody whose heart is failing so much it's not even adequately perfusing vital organs, and they're going into shock and blood pressure dropping out, you see 30 to 40% mortality, which is off the charts. If you have a heart attack, it's about 8%, just to put it into perspective. And the average length of stay in the hospital is about 19 and a half days. That adds up to over $175,000 on average when you look at the claims data. So, and what we've heard loud and clear, what we see and what we saw in the market research is people were clamoring for something new, and there's really nothing else in development other than what our program is right now.
Maybe Craig, to follow up on something that Quang mentioned just a moment ago on the topic of drug pricing. You talked about a couple of different drugs that had sort of the pricing that he had mentioned there. What factors do you think will be important for the acute hospital-based cardiovascular environment or market as it pertains to drug pricing?
Yeah, and I would distinguish between the two, as you mentioned, acute or the hospital side, because I totally agree. By the way, areas of rare disease, because of the prevalence and because of the severity, and frankly, I've worked in rare disease. A plan will say, well, how many of these people do I really have in my plan? How many should I see of these? And it can command a lot of value and pretty good price. In the area of hospitals, look, the patients are super sick, right? And there is no replacement for, big impacts to mortality and morbidity and complications. But it is such a costly environment in the hospital that, frankly, the drug that's being used for, a couple days or a day, it tends to be a fraction of the total cost to the system or to the hospital. So things such as reducing time in the ICU if they happen to be so sick that they're in an intensive care unit, because that's an extremely costly environment to be managing a patient. Length of stay in the hospital. In the area of heart failure, big time, it's also about readmissions in the next 30 days. Because if a patient is discharged from being a heart failure patient and they come back in anytime within the next 30 days, the hospital's not going to receive one penny more. They consider that part of the original reimbursement. So things like length of stay and the various parts of the hospital, in the hospital itself, from readmissions are huge cost drivers, and the ability to impact those creates really strong pharmacoeconomic evidence.
Thank you for that. Let's sort of transition the discussion now towards each of your respective programs. Quang, we'll sort of start on your side with tecarfarin. Discuss its focus in some more detail from what you started off at the beginning, and where the company is at in its drug development pathway.
Yeah, certainly, Robert. We are focused on developing tecarfarin. As mentioned before, it's a small molecule, novel, oral and reversible blood thinner, oral anticoagulant in the same class as warfarin, vitamin K antagonist. Throughout the years, 11 clinical trials have been completed with tecarfarin, safety database of over 1,000 patients and 90 million invested to date. Right now, the FDA has granted tecarfarin orphan and fast track designation for the prevention of blood clots in patients who have end-stage kidney disease and concurrent atrial fibrillation. The planned pivotal trial is about 500 patients, half on tecarfarin, half on placebo, with time to major adverse cardiac events as the primary endpoint. We're focusing on two other orphan areas. The first being implanted medical device, which include the left ventricular assist device, which is a pump to help heart failure patients. And the other area is an immune condition called aphospholipid syndrome. It's a condition where the body overproduces antibodies, which causes complications with blood clotting. Just to summarize, the programs for tecarfarin are focused on areas where warfarin has been used, but has proven to be unreliable. And in the new class of medication, or the newer class, the Eliquis class of drugs, are either contraindicated or not being prescribed. And then furthermore, we haven't seen any indication that the factor 11s are being targeted or studied in the three rare areas that we're focusing on.
Perfect. Got it. And Craig, maybe talk a little bit more about your lead drug candidate. How does it work? What is the mechanism of action? What indications is it being used for?
Yeah, so our lead drug candidate is called istaroxime, or ISTA for short. And ISTA had been under development for patients hospitalized due to their heart failure, acute heart failure. And after producing a positive phase 2A, followed by a positive phase 2B, both having about 120 patients each, We put it in front of the top heart failure experts in the US and Europe, and they got really excited about the profile, not just the positive data, but the very unique profile that we were seeing with the product, and it offsetting these old agents that they have to work with. And we went down and engaged with the FDA, great meeting, picked up a fast track designation for heart failure. But coming out of those meetings, in fact, it was one of the members of the FDA who was talking to our CMO and had posed the question that we were hearing from our advisors about the idea of studying cardiogenic shock, and pointed us to a regulatory precedent on an approval in the area of shock, a different form of shock, but how they thought about shock and the possibility of having the efficacy measure be blood pressure, which is, as we were just talking a few moments ago, very attractive. So we went out and did a study in cardiogenic shock in the middle of COVID, an ICU-based study, did a great job, and that data is really positive. So we moved cardiogenic shock, given the high unmet need in that area, to the front, and that became our lead program. And the way istaroxime is working and producing such a unique profile is it works in both cycles of the heart, and it's a dual mechanism. The very first mechanism increases the force of contraction with every heartbeat, so gets a stronger squeeze and a stronger pump that way. And then the real novel mechanism is something called circuit 2A activation, which takes calcium up out of the tissue, and cytosol causes a greater relaxation of the heart in between heartbeats in the diastolic phase. And that's when the heart fills up with blood. It pulls blood from the pulmonary veins and really helps decongest the lungs, and it fills up with a blood volume, so there's more blood available and more calcium available for the next force of contraction. And by working in both cycles of the heart, we've seen these really unique results, positive and a very unique profile that seems to have a differentiated safety profile as well.
All right. Thank you for that, Craig. Quang, coming back to sort of the three rare medical conditions of focus, right? You said, each of them is an area where warfarin has failed to achieve sufficiently stable anticoagulation, and the DOACs, or as you refer to them as the Eliquis class of drugs, are not widely prescribed or contraindicated. So, talk about the commonality between these three rare medical conditions, and provide some perspective to the overall market opportunity.
Sure, Robert. Let me, Craig just reminded me just to distinguish tecarfarin from warfarin, since we are in the same class, the vitamin K antagonist, and for 70 plus years, the only vitamin K antagonist widely used in the US was warfarin, an oral reversible blood thinner, which was brand name Coumadin. Tecarfarin is different in that the metabolism was designed to the drug was designed to be metabolized throughout the body tissue esterases instead of the P450. And in CKD, or chronic kidney disease patients, the drug tecarfarin was more was less affected with in patients with CKD than warfarin, as far as the PK level as well as the half-life. And so in those three areas, patients that require anticoagulation, as you well know, the lack of anticoagulation or ineffective could cause obviously strokes and deaths. And if you over anticoagulate, the patients bleed. So with the vitamin K antagonists, tecarfarin and warfarin, there is monitoring, the importance of monitoring the INR, the international normalized ratio, which is desirable between 2 and 3. And so when the Eliquis class of drugs came to market, they were not required. And so in these rare conditions, when warfarin's being used, you can see the fluctuations of the INR not being in range, in time and therapeutic range, specifically starting with the end-stage kidney with AFib, where warfarin, looking back for all of the trials over the years, have shown that warfarin didn't produce a benefit. And then when Apixaban or Eliquis was tried in these patients, the trial was cut short. The trial was called Renal AF. Eliquis versus warfarin was cut short in, I believe, 2018, 2019. And so when you move that over to the implanted medical devices, only patients with mechanical heart valves and left ventricular assist device, they're on warfarin for life. It has been to be the only therapy available and very unstable. So we've chosen to enter that area. And then lastly, the APS, or aphospholipid syndrome, one of the DOACs was tried and was not successful, and warfarin once again was unstable. So we believe that area requires attention, as well as a potential new agent like ticagrelor and vitamin K antagonist, so these patients could have more protection from major adverse cardiac events.
All right. Craig, maybe on the same sort of general question, I guess, on your side, sort of how is to differ from existing therapies used to treat cardiogenic shock, and then maybe just sort of backing up, talk about sort of the causes of it, the diagnosis, how it's treated. Are physicians looking for new ways to treat this condition?
Yeah, so if I were to back up, heart failure itself is, and I mentioned top reason for hospitalization in the elderly, about 1.3, 1.4 million in the US, maybe close to 1.5 million in Europe each year. And heart failure is the inability of the heart to adequately pump to meet the body's requirements or demands, right? And put very simply, some of these people, as they come into the hospital with a decompensation or unstable kick-up of this, they come into the hospital, and maybe about 1 in 12, somewhere in that range of them, their heart failure will be so bad and so severe that not only is the heart failing to adequately meet the body's demands, that it is failing so much to even adequately pump to vital organs and perfuse brain, kidneys, get proper oxygenation. And the way you see it, the way it manifests, is the pressure in the system, blood pressure, because the pump isn't really pumping and filling up the pipes and perfusing even vital organs. You see blood pressure crashing out. Our systolic blood pressure, the top number is about 120. We're talking about patients in the 80s, 70s, maybe even down in the 60s. It is a treatment emergency, because when they're in that condition and get into classic shock, like I said, 30 to 40% mortality. Now, we've gone out because there's no development, and there's nothing in development. We had to go out, get claims data, and value the market. It's about a $1.25 billion market when you do the work. And we knew that the drugs that they have to treat are generally used for something else. They tend to get reserved because the efficacy comes at a cost. If your blood pressure is crashing out, sure, it can reach and start an infusion of adrenaline, norepinephrine, and that'll throw heart rate through the roof, pound the heart, blood pressure will pull up, but so will arrhythmias, and pounding the heart's already wearing out, can wear out, and increases the demands on the heart. So they tend to get reserved because they can produce negative outcomes or really bad side effects. And istaroxime, given its unique profile that we saw in heart failure, now we're seeing in shock, rapidly and significantly got the blood pressure up and really had this efficacy without the side effects. But to test it also on the unmet need or the demand, we went out and talked to 100 US-based clinical cardiologists, asked them how much need there is for a new drug to treat cardiogenic shock. And 99 out of 100 of these guys that treat shock reported that it was highly needed. And like I said, I've been doing this 34 years. I can't recall 99 out of 100 cardiologists in any market research agreeing on one thing, so when they saw a blinded profile Vista, they said that they would be extremely likely to use it, and first thing they would touch. So we know there's a high unmet need and a lack of development there, and there's a big need. So that's what we've oriented to.
Okay. Quang, and sort of final few questions we have here, the clinical data that you have today, you touched on, I think it was 11 clinical trials, patient database, safety database of over 1,000. Maybe just make sure we understand all the data to this point, And then, what are the upcoming steps in your development process?
Sure, Robert. The genesis of the tecarfarin development program goes back obviously through 11 clinical trials, but the original IND holder had tried to do an approach for a broad label to defeat warfarin head to head in the last, the 2 decades ago, before the advent of the Eliquis class of drugs. And so the development plan has generated, over 1,000 patients in the database. Tecarfarin has proved to be very safe. And as a result, the remaining pivotal trial for end-stage kidney disease and AFib remains about 500 patients, with half on tecarfarin, half on placebo, with time to major adverse cardiac event as the primary endpoint. Certainly, the other 2 areas that we're focusing on with communication with the FDA shortly, we're looking for trials against warfarin with possibly the marker of TTR, the measurement of INR, International Normalized Ratio, within the time and therapeutic range. So those are the trials that we're going to propose in the other 2 rare medical conditions. Our development plans revolve around getting our CMC process ready in the next 3 quarters, which we are doing right now, so that we can meet our goal of starting a pivotal trial in 2024 in one of the 3 rare medical conditions.
Got it. Yeah, and Craig, same question to you. Talk about sort of the results observed thus far, or sort of expand upon that for ISTA and cardiogenic shock, and then including your most recent phase 2, and then and what the next steps are going forward here.
Yeah. So after producing, we've had a phase 2A and a phase 2B in acute heart failure, 120 patients each. And then we went out and did the cardiogenic shock study. That was in 60 patients, half got placebo, half got treatment, 2 different doses on the treatment side. The primary measure was the blood pressure profile over 6 hours. Again, such an attractive primary measure to be able to shoot forward. But of course, collecting all the other parameters of cardiac function, safety, renal, arrhythmia, and all the rest of it. And what we saw, that profile that we had produced to being able to have the first time a heart failure drug that improves cardiac function without trading off blood pressure, but in fact kicked up blood pressure, and the things we saw in heart failure with renal improvement and all the rest. Once again, in shock, by moving down to the end of the spectrum and hoping that we had the therapeutic horsepower, if you will, to take the real severe patients and rapidly improve their condition and get blood pressure up and the rest. And we saw that we could. And in fact, we saw rapid and significant increase in the blood pressure profile over 6 hours. And then that continued throughout the 24-hour infusion, and pulling patients back up above a systolic of 90, helping them get stabilized. And then even after we shut the infusion off, they did stay consistently stable. But beyond that, what really exceeded my expectations, even in the size of this trial, was the number of cardiac function improvement parameters that became statistically significant. And in fact, it's the condition of the failing heart that is causing this. Even if blood pressure improvement standing at the bedside is the immediacy, then you're really turning attention to get the heart tuned up. And we saw the amount of blood coming out of the heart over the course of a minute significantly increase. That was driven by something called stroke volume, the amount of blood coming out with each and every heartbeat, as well as just the strength and the geometry of the heart on the echoes all improved. And once again, we saw this favorable renal profile. And any critical care physician will tell you how important the kidneys are, especially when people were in big time fluid overload and you're trying to offload that fluid. Placebo, the renal function went down. So we're excited with what we're seeing. Now we're bridging towards phase 3. To do that, we're running 2 quick studies here over the next 3 quarters. One is to extend the dosing, get the dose really optimized for phase 3. We had been doing 24-hour infusions. This extension to that study, and we're calling it the extension study, is going to dose about 30 patients with a 60-hour infusion and allowing for down titration as well. Just get the dose fully optimized for the phase 3. And we also want to include the next more severe patients in the phase 3 and want to get a little bit of experience with them, ones that are already having some organ damage and so forth. And we're doing about 20 patients we're going to do in a study like that, Sky Stage C. So the teams are busy executing. Our objective is to be phase 3 ready fall of next year, about this time next year. And we think it's a phase 3 program that can be relatively fast and inexpensive. But we want to round out our database with these 2 quick, small studies.
Gotcha. And sort of in the final couple of minutes here, to both of you here, talk about your balance sheet. Obviously, it's a big topic for almost everybody here today in today's market, and sort of your outlook. And Quang, we'll start with you here.
Sure. So as mentioned before, we did our IPO and then a PIPE in July. So at the end of the third quarter, we had about $9 million in cash with $3 million in pre-funded warrants. We're burning before the clinical trial initiation about $830,000 per quarter, 16 million shares outstanding, and about the insiders own about 47% of the company. And in closing, we're very active in finding a U.S. partner to do one of our pivotal trials. We're working on our EU orphan designations, getting our CMC ready for our pivotal trial in 2024. So really glad to be here, and thanks again to Lytham Partners for having us.
Absolutely. And Craig, maybe the same question to you, and then any final closing comments that you might have as well.
Sure. So we reported on our last Q mid-year about 11.5 million on the balance sheets. We have a common outstanding of about 5.1 million. We do have regular vanilla cash warrants that we did in the last round in late April, which can be the source of bringing in some additional capital here in the next couple of quarters. But like I said, we took that successful raise, which was slightly upsized from what we wrote in the S1, and got busy with development with those couple studies and startup of those studies that I told you about. We're also quite active on the business development front as well, and we're actively engaged in a few discussions regarding possibilities that we might do either regionally or even potentially strategically with the company, if it makes sense for shareholders. But in the meantime, as I look over the next just 3 quarters or so, there is the potential for a whole lot of news flow. We have a lot of activity on development that can produce a couple data cards. We have various regulatory activity, and like I said, a lot happening on the business development, and even in our pipeline with the oral circuit 2A activators, different activity going on with the early pipeline as well. So I look forward to keeping everybody updated across all of this activity and the deliverables and the milestones, and just encourage people to look at our website, www.windtreetx.com. All of our public filings, of course, are on that as well. So thank you, Robert.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for your participation today. Greatly appreciated. I would also add this: if anyone would like to get in touch with either of the panel participants, let me know. I'd be happy to coordinate that. My email is Blum, BLUM, @lythampartners.com. So we thank you all for joining us during the conference here. We hope you enjoy the remainder of the conference. Again, Quang, Craig, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, Robert.